Appreciate your presence here tonight. And I'd like to start this topic by asking this question. Have you ever felt like the bad guys were winning? I know I'm not alone because I see some heads nodding. So keep this answer to yourself. How long ago did you feel like that? This passage that we're going to look at tonight, Revelation chapter 12 through 19, the dragon, the beast, and the harlot in Revelation, I think is a passage that shows us the worst of what Satan can do. He failed at the cross, and now he's going to use his arsenal against God's people. And when I think about Revelation, I was thinking about how you would feel and how you would feel at the time. I'm sure that when Rome was at its height and you had the persecution that was going on, if you were a Christian, you would feel rather isolated. And then we look at this book and we think about the fact that John, an apostle, was isolated himself. He was on the island of Patmos, and he was sent there because of his faith. But when he writes this letter, Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, he calls himself a brother who is in, at that time, the tribulation. And so at that time, this was going on. And I just think about how this message now today is for us, to learn from. But also, we have to remember, important to the people, the initial recipients. And it had to mean something to the initial recipients. And the fact that John here is a brother who is cast out from society because of his belief, and now he's writing this letter, would answer the question, well, where are the apostles now? What about the question, where is Jesus now? Well, Jesus is the one who's telling him to write this in a book. And so, this is a book that escaped Roman clutches. When we look at this power and this system, this is a book that we have with us today. And so, I think that the dragon, the beast, and the harlot, these chapters answer the question, what happens when government, false religion, and culture are all under Satan's command? First of all, as we look at chapter 12 here, if you have your Bibles, this is the chapter of the dragon. But first of all, we see this pregnant woman. It says in verse 1, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth." And so immediately we see this woman who, her dress includes the sun, the moon, and the stars. There is light that is here. Commentators such as Haley have pointed out that this might mean that this is a symbol of complete revelation now. In the patriarchal and Mosaic dispensations of the Old Testament, there was partial light, but now in the Christian age, there is all revelation. And so, who is this woman? And I think with Revelation, one of the dangers that people have in interpretation is that many want each figure to be a like for like. You know, if there is a woman, then that must be a person. And so some people say that this woman is the church. And some people will say that this woman is Mary. Well, we notice that in verse 13 there that she gives birth to the child. And the child is Christ. And so I wouldn't put that figure as the church because Christ is born from her. But rather I would say that this is a metaphor for anyone who is a son of God. Mark chapter 1, verse 1, Jesus was called the Son of God. And then in Romans 8:14, it says, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God." Persecution is about to begin when the child is born, and so as the Son of God, and then as sons of God, we will see sons of God are followers of God. So anyone who follows God, but it starts here with the persecution when the child is born. And we remember that in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13, that Mary and Joseph were divinely warned to escape Herod, who wanted them dead. Now, the dragon is someone who is clearly identified. The dragon is known as Satan. You can read that in verse 9, but as we see this description in verse 3, it says that he was red, and that means that he was angry. His anger was hot. He had 7 heads. This is probably referring to the complete knowledge. The number 7 will come up in this study tonight, but 7 is a number for completion, as is 10. And he has 10 horns, which meant full power, 7 diadems, which means that he was royal. He was the king of evil here. And the beast here, the dragon disrupts God's creation, not the beast, sorry. Throwing stars to the earth, and he stands before the pregnant woman, it says in verse 4, waiting to devour the child. And so he is ready to take over as soon as the child is born. The child is clearly Jesus Christ. Verse 5 summarizes that, where it says, "She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron." This goes back to Psalm chapter 2, verse 9, where it says that you shall break them with a rod of iron. That's a messianic prophecy there, referring to Jesus. And so this is Jesus Christ, and this is a summary of Jesus from his birth until his ascension. And it says here that her child was caught up to God and his throne. And so here is this child who completes his mission and then ascends back to heaven. And then it says that then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And so here is some symbolism here, the 1,260 days. Now when you see the 1,260 days elsewhere, you have the same number but referenced differently. For instance, 42 months is sometimes stands in place of 1,260 days. And then there is the expression, which you might remember from the book of Daniel, time, times, and time and a half. And so 3 years. And here is this terminology, but this terminology is symbolism that begins back in Revelation chapter 11, verses 2. At the end of verse 2 in Revelation chapter 11, it says, "And they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." Notice that these are the same durations of time that are fixed here. And the holy city here is symbolic. It is the spiritual city. It's a war against God's people. And so the sackcloth here is the mourning that will take place because of the persecution of God's people, the sons of God. So here we see this symbolism that God looks after the woman under persecution in chapter 12, verse 6. Later in the chapter, she is mounted upon the wings of an eagle in verse 14. And then in 13:5, it brings up the same duration of time that the first beast is allowed to continue blaspheming God. All of these events are transpiring simultaneously. And that's why this number keeps being brought up. And so this number, the duration of this number, symbolizes the period of intense Roman persecution that the sons of God were going to go under. We have a depiction next in verses 7 through 9 back here in chapter 12 of spiritual warfare in heaven due to Christ accomplishing his mission. It says, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now, we know from Scripture that Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, that we deal with the spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. And so what we are seeing is a depiction, a picture of what spiritual warfare looks like. Do we know everything about what happens? We know pretty much what is revealed to us. And so it's in this terminology, and this is what transpired as Jesus fulfilled his message. The devil was cast out to the earth when Jesus fulfilled his mission, rather. And so the solution is that because Christ conquered Satan through the cross, Satan can be overcome by the spiritually inclined who do not fear even martyrdom. And verse 10 and 11 show us that. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. So, what comes next is the devil's reaction to this certain victory. In verse 12, it says, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell on them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. So here is why he is angry. He was defeated, and so he turns his attention to something else he could do. He could not get to Christ. He could not devour the child. So now, verse 13, he's going to go after the woman. It says, now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And so again, we see that 1260 days, or that 42 months. The same symbology comes up again, and she is nourished. But also there are the wings of a great eagle. And that would alert the reader back to the Old Testament. And of course, as a lot of the people who have taught this class over these weeks have said, is that the symbology of Revelation counts on the reader being familiar with the Old Testament. And so the things that were in the Old Testament were teaching them something about what this symbology meant, what this figurative representation was. And so back in the Old Testament, when there was deliverance from Egypt in Exodus 19:4, which is recalled in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11, these same terms were used, the wings of an eagle. And also, it's really a familiar Old Testament theme. You have it brought up in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. And so next, what the devil is going to do is empty his arsenal at the woman. It says, but the woman, verse 15, so the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. And he's going, so this is an image of he's going to throw everything that he has at the woman so that she can be carried away. But, verse 16, the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. So the woman is going to be protected, but the dragon here in verse 17 was enraged with the woman, and he went out to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And so again, when I see that in verse 17 it says that the child would not, the dragon could not get the child, but now the dragon is going after the rest of her offspring. I think about the sons of God again, and that that God gives us that his son was the firstborn among many brethren, and that you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus, in Galatians chapter 3, verse 26. But the key there is those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ are the ones that are protected from the dragon during this intense time of persecution. So in chapter 12, if we summarize that, Satan lost his battle with Christ, but will now go after his family. And then, as we look at chapter 13 is going to be the beginning of Satan attacking Christ's family. And so, first of all, we have the beast, was my topic, but there's actually two beasts here. And the first beast is in verses 1 through 10, which is the sea beast. So who does Satan use to attack Christ's family? Well, first is this beast who has 7 heads, 10 horns, with 10 crowns, and a blasphemous name. And we notice here that it says that, John says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority." And so, again, the Old Testament reader, would the Old Testament reader think of something if he were to read this message that John was writing that Jesus gave him? Well, yes, he would. Daniel's chapters 2 and verse 7 parallels what we see here. In Daniel chapter 7, he saw 4 great beasts coming up from the sea. All were different from one another. And you notice here that this sea beast has the power of the dragon. Now, you remember back in Daniel chapter 2 that when Daniel interpreted the dream for Nebuchadnezzar, he also saw 4 kingdoms there. And so in chapter 2 of Daniel, Babylon, which Nebuchadnezzar was the king of at that time, who Daniel said, he was the head of gold. In chapter 7, the lion is Babylon. Medo-Persia was that inferior kingdom that was going to come, that was prophesied about. And Medo-Persia had a chest and arms of silver in chapter 2, but in chapter 7, Medo-Persia is the bear. Well, next was Greece. Greece was the belly and thighs of bronze in chapter 2, and then the leopard in chapter 7. And then there's Rome, the legs of iron in chapter 2, and the terrifying and frightening beast in chapter 7. Well, here is this great power that has taken all of these powers, and now it is kind of built up. You can think of this ball that's rolling and gathering all of these powers, and now this might of all these powers has been swallowed up into that, and that is this great city of Rome. And all of this is, of course, contrasted with the kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom that shall not be left to other people, which shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever, which is the church. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, 45, which is also known as the kingdom. So I contend that the sea beast best fits the Roman emperor at that time. We look at verses 3 and 4 here. It says, "And I saw one of its heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?'" Well, when I read this, he is mortally wounded and then healed and then followed by the world. I see a likeness, and other commentators have too, to Nero. When Rome burned in 64 AD, it was widely documented that Nero blamed it on the Christians, and he ended up having public executions of Christians at that time, and that even at the time it was foreign to Rome, and that Romans felt sympathy for the Christians at that time, and that most likely under his reign Peter and Paul were martyred. But then Nero had those that were against him, and so he ended up going into despair and ended up committing suicide. As it was reported, he did. Some scholars say that there was someone there because he could not do it himself, who he had do it. But after Nero committed suicide, or after he had someone do it for him, there was a period of turmoil that ensued there. Nero was the last of the Julio-Claudio line of Caesars. So that's Julius Caesar, Claudius, that line. But in 1 year, in 69 AD, Rome had 4 emperors: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. And so they finally settled on Vespasian, but at that time, there were all kinds of rumors going around. I mean, there were factions and people who wanted to appoint emperors, and the person didn't want to be an emperor. But at that time, what happened was that they finally settled on Vespasian, but there were rumors that were circulating that there would be Nero returning, or that this suicide didn't actually take place. And so that there was a lot of turmoil in the kingdom at that time. And so Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79, he ended up founding the Flavian dynasty, and his son was Domitian that came out of that. And so Nero here, as being the one who is mortally wounded and healed, I would say that that is symbolic about the emperor. You know, the emperor who started the persecution, he died, but there is going to be another one that rises up that carries on like him. And I think that that's the picture there. And so here we have the sea beast worshipped, and so therefore the dragon is worshipped, and we look at what is said here: who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? Therefore the sea beast is worshipped because of the great power he has, the fear of the great strength of military might there, and he blasphemes and speaks against God for the duration of time stated, which is 42 months, which we see in verse 5. It says, "And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven." So again, he is an agent of war against the saints. And when we look at some of the things that Domitian did, Domitian is the one that really brought back the pagan worship. Nero did not want an image made to him. They found one image, I guess, that had been burned down that was made to him, but he really didn't want an image to him. But Domitian was very open to that. And so as we read this, it says, verse 7, "It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." And so, who has the power to do this but the emperor? You know, making war with the saints and overcoming them. And here is this choice that is to be made in verse 8. You either worship this person or worship God. And Domitian is the one who started that, where he accepted worship to him as emperor, as God. In fact, Domitian was the first emperor known to give himself the title of Dominus et Deus, which is Lord and God, and required people to worship his image. And so, again, you have that familiar refrain, if you remember back in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 3, to the churches, he who has an ear, let him hear. Well, who is that written to? It's written to the people who are about to undergo this intense persecution. So know that this is going to happen. And so, at the time of the writing of this book, I believe that Domitian was the emperor, and although there's a lot of talk about how many executions Domitian carried out, I do believe that he got the ball rolling, at least, in the way that he was worshipped, and the fact that he had an image that was made to him seemed to fit this. Also, there were some writers around the time, such as Irenaeus, who said that John had the vision here in Revelation close to the end of Domitian's reign. And then Clement of Alexandria said that John, after working in the mines for Domitian as in exile there, returned to Ephesus after Domitian's death. Now, Domitian was eventually assassinated by being stabbed to death by Stephanus and others, but of course this will grow back, as we see with this image here of emperor. Now the earth beast. The earth beast here, notice that the earth beast is like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And it says in verse 12, and he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. And so you have this earth beast, and he's performing great signs in the sight of the beast. And he commands an image to be made to the sea beast. It says, verse 13, he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. And Sweet, in his commentary, talks about this in some detail. He says that the Caesar worship was a state function in which the proconsul and the other magistrates assisted, and the pagan priesthood brought their gifts before these representatives of the empire. This earth beast may well have been represented by the best known magician of the age, that is, one who performs these magical works and making the people believe that he is a god. Thus, in the immediate view of John, the second beast represents the sorcery and superstition of the age engaged in a common attempt to impose the Caesar cult upon the provinces behind which there lay the satanic purpose of bringing ruin upon the rising Christian brotherhood. In its wider significance, the symbol may well stand for any religious system which allies itself with the hostile forces of the world against the faith of Jesus Christ. And so the sea beast is recognized as the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived, the office of Roman emperor. But then what are we talking about here with this earth beast? Well, as we continue to read, he was granted power, verse 15, to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So his office, in other words, brings this emperor worship to life. He validates the idol of the emperor, and anyone who does not worship the emperor is in jeopardy, such as John here, who's exiled. And so here in verse 16 and 17, it says, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So the choice, accept the mark, worship the beast, or your means of livelihood are going to be taken away. That's the threat. And so the kingdom, both small and great, everybody has got to follow this earth beast. And so verse 18, it says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, his number is 666. And so now we get to this number, which, has been talked about for ages. Who is this man? Are we going to use cryptography on this? Sometimes you'll read commentaries, they'll point back and they'll use cryptography. But one of them that comes up is Nero, but Nero, when you look at it, is the Hebrew letters for what was written in the first century, which was written in the book of Revelation, which was written in Greek. Some have said that this is Latino, who was responsible for the initiation of what would become later on the popes, the papacy. But yet others also say that this is a number which is not the number of one particular person, but the summation of man, 666, that numerology, being imperfect, falling just short of the perfection of man, of the perfection of God, which 777 would be complete. And so when you think about Rome from the culture and from where it saw itself, and you think about how they thought that they were the highest place, civilly, the highest place technologically, intellectually, and now they're bringing worship into this, then you can see how one might think that this is what is being talked about here. I think that the earth beast here is that initial pagan priesthood that represented Rome. And that's what is being talked about here. Because if you look at it as it's the line of popes, that didn't transpire until later. And when you look back at the popes were named after the fact. Peter is a pope, even though there's no record of him ever being in Rome. Okay? And then you have bishops and whatnot in the names of popes. Clement was one of them, I believe. But here is this imperfection that all of this glory that is there, the splendor that is so bewitching to people, represents. And again, Haley in his commentary says, throughout the book, 7 expresses the idea of perfection or completeness. The 7 churches, 7 horns, 7 eyes, 7 spirits, and so forth. So 6, which falls below the sacred 7, can never be 7 or reach perfection. Therefore, it symbolizes the imperfect, that which is human, and destined to fail. It is said that to the Jews, the number 6 was an omen or symbol of dread and doom, so when it was tripled, 666, it represented the completeness of doom and failure. And so the remaining passages in Revelation regarding the beasts and their mark are related to their condemnation, contrasted with the faithful who do not bow before them. Now, when you go into chapter 14, you have the earth beast, who is that lamb with 2 horns, but then you have a sharp contrast with the Lamb, Christ, standing on Mount Zion, the holy city. Now the harlot. The harlot is found in Revelation chapter 17 through 19. I think you can contrast what we saw in Revelation 12, the woman who was about to give birth with child. Her and the harlot are different. In many ways, they are extremely different. Here, this harlot sits on many waters, talking about the geographical expanse of the Roman territory that is contained here. The kings of the earth committed fornication with her. The inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication, it says in verse 2. And the pregnant woman that you had that gave birth to the child, she was pure. She belonged to God. She had fine linen. She was holy. She was protected by God in the wilderness. But the harlot is, as we read about her, she is corrupt. She's fit for destruction. She belongs to the beasts and the kings of the world. She's clothed in purple and scarlet, gold and precious stones and pearls, full of abominations, drunk on the blood of martyrs, etc. She sits on this scarlet beast in verse 3, which was full of names, blasphemy, having 7 heads and 7 horns. And this is the emperor seat that enables the culture of spiritual harlotry, I believe. The beast, the emperors who persecute the Christians, eventually go to perdition in verse 8. And we think about this city now of Rome in the 1st century BC. There was a Roman poet by the name of Tibullus who called Rome the eternal city. And several poets named it that and continue to call that, such as Virgil. Well, after Nero died and Rome had this rebirth in the cultural mind through Vespasian, the Romans arrogantly concluded that the city would never be threatened again. And so as we think about this back in Revelation 13, verses 3 and 4, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? Who's able to stand up to the power of Rome? Nobody. And that's what they thought. And so the description on her forehead here, Mystery Babylon, the great, the mother of harlots, of the abominations of earth. And here is this mark on her forehead. The combination of harlotry and the name here adds up to spiritual fornication. A common theme in the Old Testament was apostasy as spiritual fornication. And so this is what you have with the harlot. And John marvels at the scene. And so the angel proceeds to tell John here in verse 9 that the 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are 7 kings. The 10 horns represent 10 kings who receive the power for 1 hour, which is short in time in verse 12. And then we see the key to what will take place in verse 14. In verse 13, they're of one mind, so this is a concentrated power. But they're going to make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. So the revelation here is that this Rome, this city, is a city of spiritual harlotry. And so the harlot represents Rome. And that great city, Babylon, it's called by its name in Revelation. It's not called by what, the Romans called it, who were in line with this spiritual fornication. It's called Babylon. And Rome at that time was the great city which reigned over all of these kings on earth. And so in chapter 18, when you look at it, an angel descends crying that Babylon has fallen. And there's a division there. Those who committed fornication with her in verses 3 and 4, and those who hear the warning to come out of her, to come out of that wicked city. And so they're invited into that holy city, that kingdom, that new Jerusalem that's symbolized there. Remember, Jerusalem is long gone at this point. And so in chapter 19, you have the contrast with the scene in heaven, with the scene of the fall of Babylon on earth. There's rejoicing. Justice has been served. All are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb and to be on the victorious side. And then you have Christ, who's contrasted with the harlot. In all caps again, you have in 1916, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And the beast and the earth, they try to make war against heaven. But the beast and false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire, and the rest are killed with the sword proceeding from the mouth of Christ and the white horse. So, again, as I summarize this, Revelation chapter 12 through 19 is a template of Satan's full arsenal against God's people. It is a picture of government, religion, and culture all under the command of Satan. And so if we think about it, there is a picture there. We can see likenesses, I think, in what happened here. But this was for a concentrated period. And that image remains. Satan still uses the same tactics. And nations that leave God, appoint idols and false gods, and persecute his faithful can expect a similar judgment, because there's only one true city, that eternal city, which is New Jerusalem. So, thank you for your time. Sorry for going over.